Chag Sameach, everyone. Whither thou goest, I shall go. Wherever you dwell, I shall dwell. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Wherever you die, I shall die, and there I will be buried. Perhaps, arguably, the most beautiful declaration in all of Tanakh, in all of Bible. Even romantic, I would say, except that Ruth declares these words not to her husband, but to her mother-in-law. And with those words, Ruth becomes, at least is considered to be, the first convert, the first ger to Judaism. Now, technically that's probably not true. Because, well, first of all, there's no mikvah, right? There's no ceremony of conversion in the story, although the Midrash says that, of course, they took her, the rabbis, took her to the mikvah to have a conversion. Probably it was Rabbi Hornston, because she does a lot of the mikvah work around here. But there's no ceremony. And also in the Torah, which precedes, of course, this book, there are plenty of people who are called ger v'toshav. These are strangers who live among the people of Israel, marry into the people of Israel, and were considered part of the people of Israel. But let's just go with the idea that Ruth is the first official convert to Judaism, at least according to our tradition. So let me give you the backstory. Ruth's mother-in-law, we mentioned her already, Naomi, and her husband Elimelech, and their two sons had fled from Judah, where they lived, from Israel, to the land of Moab because of a terrible famine. And they lived there, and they integrated into the community, and their two sons married two local girls, Ruth, and does anyone know the name of the other one? Good, Orpah, which is actually the source of the American name Oprah. And that's important because Oprah Winfrey is actually going to figure in a significant way into this sermon. Because, it's true, because Oprah Winfrey, with all of her many strengths and accomplishments, may be the world's worst theologian. Oprah Winfrey single-handedly taught a generation of Americans, women and some men, that everything happens for a reason. She says it all the time, and we have been mimicking her since that. And the truth is that it's an okay theology if you, for instance, lose your job. I lost my job, don't worry, everything happens for a reason. You'll find a new job, and you know what? It may even be a better job. Okay. Not such a good theology for people who lost 6 million Jews to the slaughter of the Nazis during the Holocaust. Not such a good theology if you've lost a son to Ewing sarcoma, or more recently, actually, in our congregation, to a terrible disease called NF. Not such a good way to think about it, that, oh, God did this on purpose to you. So that's an adumbration of the end of the sermon. I believe that the book of Ruth actually gives us an antidote for that very flawed and faulty theology. So we're going to move from Orpah or Oprah back to Ruth. So what happens? The sons die, and the wives are left as widows, and it's not a very good situation. So Naomi, the mother-in-law, does the kind thing and says, I love you, but you really should go back to the houses of your mothers so that you can be taken care of, because I'm not going to have any more sons for you. Back in those days, another brother could have married the widows, but I'm too old to have another son for you, so you better go back where you can be taken care of. I can't take care of you. And Orpah eventually, reluctantly goes back, but as you know, Ruth refuses and utters those beautiful words, "Whither thou goest, I shall go." So they do go back to Judah, and times are still very difficult. And so how do you make a living? How do you eat? Well, you remember from the Torah, we have that wonderful phrase that when you reap your harvest, you must leave the corners of the field for the poor. Well, Ruth was one of those poor people. And she goes and reaps the field, the corners of the field, at the field of a relative of her mother-in-law, really her father-in-law, named Boaz. Now, Boaz, she sort of catches his eye. And I think he has a little crush because he tells his workers, you know what, not only should you let Ruth glean the corners of the field, but you know what, take some of the good wheat that's already in the cart and throw it out to the sides right in front of her so that she'll be able to have a feast, which she does. Well, her mother-in-law realizes that something is going on. So she instructs her daughter-in-law, you know what, Boaz is sleeping at the threshing mills, it's harvest time. Why don't you go and lay down, uncover his feet, and lay down with him. Now, what does uncovering his feet mean? It's possible that it's a kinky sexual act. I mean, I'm going to say that is one of the interpretations, and that is one of the possibilities. As we'll see a little bit later in the story, it probably has more to do with this custom that kinsmen, if there's no brother to marry the woman, kinsmen can marry the widow. And it's important because in those days, you could not sell your land to people outside of your clan. So in other words, one of the ways they kept the tribes intact was they said, if someone dies and they would be entitled to this piece of land, then one of the relatives can take the land, but if they take the land, they also have to take the wife. Or vice versa. If they take the wife, they also have to take the land. As it turns out, Boaz is very interested. However, there is a redeemer, in other words, another relative, a little bit closer, who would have that right. It's a long story, we're not getting into it. Boaz goes to sort of a court, the gates of the city, and says, I would like to redeem Ruth and her land, but you have first dibs, and the gentleman refuses, because if he gets the land, he also gets the wife. He gets the wife, he also gets any future children. If he gets any future children, he has to divide his inheritance among them as well. Got it? So and plus his other wife would probably kill him. That's the other reason why he probably says no. In any case, Boaz and Ruth get married. They have a son, and that son, remember, this is a Jew by choice. This is a convert to Judaism. That son has a son. His name is Jesse, like my Jesse. I don't think this Jesse was a snowboard instructor in Colorado, but he has a son named Jesse. And does anyone know who Jesse's son was? David. King David. This is an important point. It's not the point of the sermon, but it's an important point because it shows what a heralded and precious role Jews by choice have in our community. That the Bible chooses the great-grandson of a Jew by choice to be the king of all Israel. But back to our theological issue and problem. I decided this is not a typical Yizkor sermon, as you probably heard. I actually decided to talk about Ruth because a good friend of mine who happens to be here wrote an email or made a call and said, aren't you guys gonna chant the book of Ruth or the scroll of Ruth? And I said, no, but I'm gonna talk about Ruth today. So that's really why we're talking about this here today, because it's such a beautiful story and I wanted to bring it to bear. And it begs the question, why do we discuss Ruth on Shavuot of all times? The Talmud gives a few answers. One of them is that this all happens around the barley harvest, and Shavuot is the celebration of the barley harvest, so that could be it. Another source says that it's because Ruth's conversion to Judaism is parallel to the acceptance of Torah by the children of Israel at Mount Sinai. There's a third reason, which is not in the Talmud. It's from the book of Yedwab. And it's that on Shavuot, we also commemorate or we participate in this Yizkor, this memory of our loved ones, which is going to get us back to our theological question. When I was in rabbinical school, we had a practical rabbinical class, and we were dealing with Shiva. And the professor said, well, here are all the things you should never say in a house of Shiva. including everything happens for a reason, and it was for the best, and and don't worry, you'll get over it, and all these terrible things that people say. By the way, if this ever happens to you, just put a little translator in your head. This is good advice. And no matter how stupid the thing that they say is, you translate it to, I care, I'm here, I have no idea how to help, but I wish I could. Right, that's what they mean to say, but they do it in really stupid ways, okay? So anyway, we have a class in this, and they tell us, don't say this and don't say that. So I raise my hand and say, but professor, so what are we supposed to say? And he said, well, you give them a hug and you say, I'm sorry. So for my first 3 years as a rabbi, every Shiva home that I went to, I gave the person a hug and I said, I'm sorry. I was doing the funeral, my first funeral of a suicide, an 18-year-old boy who committed suicide, and I went into the Shiva house and I put my arms around the mother and I said, I'm so sorry. And she looked at me and says, sorry? What do you have to be sorry about? This wasn't your fault. And I realized the true answer is there's nothing right to say. There's nothing right to say. But that doesn't mean there can be no comfort. So let me give you another image. Same Shiva house. A grandchild of another son, comes up to the same woman, right? Grabs her leg because she was crying and gives her a big hug. And what do you think happened? She smiled. She smiled. Maybe for the first time since this terrible tragedy. And what that teaches us is exactly, I think, what the book of Ruth teaches us. There was no reason for both of Naomi's sons to die. But Ruth found meaning in the relationship that she had built with her mother-in-law. Whither thou goest, I shall go. Where you die, I will die. And there I shall be buried. And Ruth thus becomes the great-grandmother of the king of Israel, because she was able to find meaning even in her loss. So I want to go back to this child. As you know, our congregation lost a wonderful young man recently, Nick Gilbert of blessed memory, and he died of a terrible rare disease called NF. And his parents have created a foundation to find a solution to it. And I was in their house just with his father and we were talking about this very question. Why do bad things happen to good people? And he actually asked the question, did this happen for a reason? And we both agreed, no, it did not. But then he looked up and said, that's true, it did not. But you know what? If we can find a cure for this terrible disease, then at least he would not have died in vain. So here's the lesson. Everything does not happen for a reason. Every loss does not happen for a reason. But in the face of loss, you can still give it meaning. You can draw meaning from even the worst tragedy. So, in the spirit of Ruth, I wish you a joyous Shavuot, even as we turn to the sadness and the eternal lessons of this book of Ruth with the ceremony of Yizkor on page 185.